There are places we think we're safe, our homes, the sanctuaries where we lay our heads at night, shielded from the outside world. But when that security is violently ripped away, the horror can be almost unimaginable. These are the stories of lives destroyed in the worst possible way by strangers breaking into their homes, leaving only terror and tragedy in their wake. The Clutter family murders, Holcomb, Kansas, 1959. The Clutter family represented the epitome of what a typical American family was like in the late 1950s. Hardworking, respected in their small rural town of Holcomb, Kansas, and seemingly untouched by the evils of the world. Herb Clutter was a prosperous farmer, well known for his honesty and generosity. His wife, Bonnie, was a gentle soul. Though her life was made difficult by mental health issues, she was not without warmth. Their children were Nancy, a brilliant high school senior, and Kenyon, the shy and introverted teenage son. The children were popular and loved by their parents. Life, in so many ways, seemed just perfect for the Clutter family until November 15th, 1959, when everything came down in the most horrific way possible. Perry Smith and Dick Hickok, two strangers, had been running from the law for years, spiraling deeper, with every move into crimes and desperation. The two men had been having word of the Clutters, word that Herb Clutter was known to keep a safe containing $10,000 in his home. Now, they had visions of easy money, an almost perfect crime in sight. They little realized that these acts of brutal violence would send ripples of astonishment and horror through this quiet, tranquil community that would be never the same again. On that fateful night, Smith and Hickok broke into the Clutter home, expecting to find an easy target. But what started as a robbery quickly turned into a massacre. The first to be tied up and restrained was Herb Clutter, while the rest of the family, Nancy and Kenyon, was soon corralled into the basement, all bound and gagged. The killers did not recover the enormous sum of money which they were expecting. Apparently, that lack of reward infuriated them, as the further acts of violence and cruelty were performed on the poor family. At the mercy of Smith and Hickok, each of the Clutters was shot in the head in the basement in a cold blood. Herb, Bonnie, as well as the children. Then, the two children were shot too, Nancy and Kenyon. Lives snuffed out one after another. These killers took little more than a few dollars and some personal items. But the devastation they had left was far beyond anything material. They fled, believing they left no trace, but they were wrong. Because the police tracked them down partly due to an active informer's tip-off and partly by their carelessness, in weeks Perry Smith and Richard Hickok were apprehended and arrested for murder. The trial and subsequent execution of the two men set a nation talking about crime and punishment and the mind of man. What could have made these men do such a thing? How could this family, so well liked and so well known, turn out to be victims of such brutal violence? The murder of the Clutter family left very deep scars among the people who knew them. This shocking case spread the shock throughout Holcomb, Kansas, a place where life was quiet, where security was like the rising of the sun. For years afterward, many wondered if anyone could ever again feel safe in his own home. Truman Capote's In Cold Blood became the haunting exploration of the murders, dissection of the psychology of the killers, and tragic fate of the Clutter family. But it was the community's loss and the awareness that such horror could strike anywhere without warning that lingered long after the final pages were turned. The Amityville Horror, Amityville, New York, 1974. The story of the Amityville Horror has lain in many people's minds since it happened, being something that really has shifted the threshold between true crime and the supernatural. The tragedy that occurred within the DeFeo family in 1974 initiated what was to be considered a real curse in this particular building, the one at 112 Ocean Avenue. On the night of November 13, 1974, one of the most horrific acts of violence ever committed against a family occurred when Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. murdered 6 members of his family in their sleep. His mother, father, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters all were shot in execution style while they were in their beds, unaware. Butch's chilling claim afterward that voices in the house had told him to commit the murders only added to the eerie mystery surrounding the crime. Butch was a problematic young man with a number of prior arrests for various other criminal behavior. He also had very troubled relationships, especially with his father. His mental condition had slowly degraded over the years, fed by substance abuse and increasing paranoia. But the murder of his family didn't just stop right there at his arrest. It marked the beginning of a story to spiral down into the domain of horror and superstition. The house did not sell for over a year after the murders, until a young couple, George and Kathy Lutz, purchased it, along with their 3 children. What was to be a new beginning for this family turned into an utter nightmare, one which later would become an inescapable reality. After 28 days, the Lutz family ran away from that house, leaving behind everything they possessed. Their experiences in the house were nothing short of terrifying. Strange noises, inexplicable physical changes within the house, and terrifying paranormal occurrences. Most disturbing, however, was the gradual transformation of George Lutz. He began to grow increasingly violent, exhibiting behavior that mirrored that of the violent figures from the house's past. They spoke of cold spots, the sound of unearthly noises like voices and footsteps, and visions of ghostly apparitions. At one point, they even witnessed green slime oozing from the walls, a grotesque manifestation that nobody could explain. Meanwhile, as George Lutz became increasingly withdrawn, his wife Kathy began to experience lucid nightmares and disturbing visions that fastened onto her physical and mental states. The Lutz family fled the house, unable to take the supernatural terror anymore. And the media frenzy began. Was it really haunted, or had the Lutz family exaggerated their experiences? Paranormal investigators and skeptics alike weighed in on the validity of their claims. Some said it was only psychological stress, while others believed that the house was cursed, and the malevolent forces were enhanced by the tragic murders that occurred in that house just a year before. The house became a symbol of fear, and its story has since been immortalized in books, films, and documentaries. If the tragic original murders committed by Butch DeFeo were not enough, the supposed haunting of the house added to the eerie allure of 112 Ocean Avenue. Whether full-on believer in the supernatural or not, to believe an entire family could be driven to violence by something within the very walls of their home speaks to a much darker mystery, a darkness that, for many, remains unsolved to this day. The Pettit family home invasion, Cheshire, Connecticut, 2007 modern America, has faced its fair share of horrific home invasions. But perhaps the most tragic of them would have to be the story of the Pettit family. Dr. William Petit was a well-respected endocrinologist who, along with his wife Jennifer and their 2 daughters, Haley and Michaela, lived in the quiet, affluent neighborhood of Cheshire, Connecticut. They had everything to look forward to. Their perfect life was shattered when early on the morning of July 23, 2007, 2 criminals, Joshua Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes, plotting to rob them and leave with as much as they could carry, decided to target their home. It started as what felt and appeared to be a random invasion into this home, spiraling into a ruthless and brutal crime. Komisarjevsky and Hayes had been watching the Petit family for weeks. They knew Dr. Petit's routine, and they knew the family had recently withdrawn money from the bank. The one thing they didn't quite anticipate finding was how their crime would spiral out of control with such ferocity. They invaded the Petit household in the dead of night, binding Dr. Petit and his wife Jennifer. The 2 criminals split the couple's daughters to make them suffer their respective horrors. As the night wore on, this invasion became more violent and terrifying. The family was forced to endure hours of physical and emotional torture inflicted by Komisarjevsky and Hayes, as they took turns with the assault, while at the same time threatening their lives. They eventually forced Dr. Petit to accompany them to a nearby bank to withdraw money from his account. The attackers returned home and continued to commit an even worse crime. Finding themselves in danger since the family could identify them, the 2 men burned the Petit house down in order to destroy the evidence of their heinous crime. The fire department did not arrive in time, and by that time, the house was engulfed in flames, and it was too late to save Jennifer or her daughters. Dr. Petit survived, but would never be the same. He had witnessed the complete destruction of his family, and the trauma from that night haunted him for years afterward. Komisarjevsky and Hayes were arrested, tried, and convicted for their crimes. They were sentenced to death, although it would later be abolished in the state of Connecticut. The case sent the town of Cheshire, indeed, the country, into a state of utter shock. How could such senseless violence take place in a place so ordinary, so safe? The Petit family was subjected to an unimaginable loss in which fate nonetheless placed its paces. Dr. Petit became an outspoken advocate for victims of crime and worked tirelessly to ensure that justice would be served in respect to his family. But the scars would never be healed from that night. Pain in the survivors of home invasion almost never dissipates, lingering upon the walls, in the memories, or rather even in the left spaces. These chilling stories remind us that no place, no matter how familiar or safe, is immune to violence or tragedy. The sanctity of home, once thought impenetrable, can be shattered in an instant by the most unimaginable horrors. And while the scars left on these families may never fully heal, their stories serve as a haunting reminder of how fragile our sense of security truly is.